Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. It's May 25th, 2020. It's interesting because when I put this idea out there, I got a lot of response from people that were eager to hear about this. I'll often refer to attachment-based or attachment-informed therapy as the overarching umbrella under which we operate here at Evoke. So I'm going to take you through a series of concepts, some quotes and some ideas, and I'm going to kind of expand on each of those as I go. And one thing to understand about this idea is that attachment theorists often don't make a very strong connection to therapy and therapy practice. People that study attachment historically aren't necessarily therapists. And so we're trying to extrapolate from what we know about healthy attachment and apply it to parenting, to reparative therapy, to our own experience and to our own healing. That's one of the fascinating parts about this idea, and that's why it's not necessarily attachment therapy, but it's attachment-based or attachment-informed therapy. I was at an attachment conference some years ago, and I believe the woman was from Scandinavia. She was showing us about her work. She showed us this wonderful video that was so powerful and moving, where a young mother was playing with a young son. That the son was able to sit up. He was a pre-toddler, wasn't able to walk quite yet. And she was just watching, being observed, playing with her child. And she poured out a bunch of toys on the floor, and the boy was grabbing for some of these, and she kept trying to kind of get his attention. At one point, he was reaching toward the camera because that was obviously a distraction to him, and the mother was trying to redirect him. And then she was playing with him, trying to stimulate him. Through a series of video training and education, she was able to learn a serve and return kind of response to her child. In other words, developing an attunement to what her child needed and what her child was looking for and responding to. And then it went forward to some exchange between them far in the future after several of these training sessions. And in this particular exercise, they were sitting on a couch and she poured out the toys again from the bag. And the small child went to grab for the bag. It was kind of a netted bag. And her first instinct, you could see very, very subtly this exchange where she started to move the bag away, and then she gave the bag to the child, and she started playing peekaboo with the bag. And then again, the child started to get his attention distracted by the cameras, and then she took the child over and closer to the camera. And you could see the difference in the child and how he was responding to his mother when she was trying to stimulate him and imposing her agenda on him versus later on in her training when she was responding to the child's cues. She was attuned to the child, and her agenda wasn't eclipsing the child. Flash forward to another video where they were watching her watch her video, and she was seeing the difference between her early exchanges with the child, which I would try to describe to you were incredibly subtle. If you were watching it with the untrained, with the uncritical eye, you wouldn't see anything wrong with it. There was nothing especially traumatic about her earlier interactions with her baby. But then later on, you could definitely see the child's face light up and watch the child change as she responded to him. And after watching the new video and really kind of seeing the difference in the exchanges between her and her young child, she turned to the researcher, to the teacher, and she said, "Is it okay if I take this video home? I want to show this to my mother because she didn't think I could be a good mother." And I thought that was so powerful and so beautiful to watch through simple training, watch this mother kind of, along with her infant child, blossom. So when we talk about attachment, we're talking about nearly invisible exchanges between parent and child in many examples. In fact, it's hard when you're in the position of the parent to see it, and that's why videotaping is often used when they're doing psychoeducation and skills training with parents. Oftentimes it's mothers, but it can be fathers also. It's usually the primary caregiver, but they'll bring in both parents at times. The exchanges are subtle and almost imperceptible. And what you do see is you do see a different response with the child. There was another video that this woman showed of inner city New York City mothers and their children. And again, the mother was providing a safe context for the child, but when she learned serve and return to her child. When she learned to respond to the child's cues, you could see the face of the child light up in the exchange. So today I'm going to talk about what we think we know about attachment research and the process of attachment and how it can inform us in our therapy. When we think about attachment theory and attachment research, oftentimes it's psychoeducation, skills training, that serve and return kind of response. And later on, we talk about attachment repair and therapy that can serve to repair attachment trauma or attachment fractures. So I'm going to talk about that. One of my favorite books that talks about attachment theory and really presents not only the clinical side, the therapeutic side, but the research side is Siegel and Hartzell's book, Parenting from the Inside Out, which I often reference on these podcasts. And they say research suggests that children who have had a positive connection in life have a source of resilience for dealing with life challenges. Essentially, like I teach, we essentially know a couple of things about attachment. We know that a secure attachment, which is based on the ability of the parent to provide a child with a sense of security and safety, and also a sense of being welcomed. We know that providing a secure attachment to a child is the most powerful contribution a parent can make to a child's well-being, to their lifelong development and mental health. It's not an absolute measure, but it's the closest thing to a silver bullet that we know, a secure attachment. But what's profound about our knowledge about attachment, and Siegel and Hartzell do well to illustrate this in their book, is that the ability of a parent to provide a secure attachment is based on how clearly they've made sense out of their own life. It's not the quality of one's childhood that predicts their ability to give this to the child. It's how well we've come to understand it, how well we've unpacked it and unraveled it and looked at it critically and closely and understood the messages, the roles, the rules, the meta communication. And that's why therapy or self-help work is critical, even in situations where you would not identify your childhood as being traumatic. I think what it also does is it takes away a lot of the shame and the blame that many parents feel, right? Mental health and our understanding of attachment as children, it's just that if we haven't looked at the dents, doesn't matter the size of the dents or the amount of the dents, if we haven't looked at the dents and considered the bruises, which are all worthy of consideration, we are less capable of seeing, attuning to a child, mentalizing, which is to understand how a child might be feeling, what's behind the behavior, and then responding clearly and with empathy. And if you want more about that, again, read or listen to the podcasts that I've done. I've done several of them on Siegel and Hartzell's book, Parenting from the Inside Out. I talk about this in The Journey of the Heroic Parent. It's a fairly high bar, but it tells you again how this can't be faked. Somebody said recently, and I get this question all the time, give me more concrete strategies to deal with my child. And I directed them toward a couple of my podcasts and webinars, specifically the 8 tools, control versus influence, and some podcasts and broadcasts that talk more about behaviors. But the reason why I struggle to answer the question is because it's not something that can be faked. It's not something that is measured by its behavior. It is more subtle than that. It is our response to the child at a deep, sensitive psychological level. It is how we think and feel about the child that impacts how the child comes to see themselves. And since this wiring happens at an important age, at a critical age, where the brain development is rapid, it does take years often to repair small, medium, and large attachment fractures and attachment issues. And again, there's no shame in that. There's not hopelessness in that idea. It's just an understanding that this can become our life's work to understand and unwrap this. Harville Hendricks said it this way. He said, we are born in relationship. We are, I knew there was going to be a typo tonight. I'm sorry. I was doing this at the last minute. We are born in relationship and we can be healed in relationship. Sorry for the typo. So part of the idea of attachment-informed therapy is there's a reparenting experience, a re-experiencing of ourselves in the presence of an empathic other, a non-anxious, non-frustrated, non-eager, capable other. And it's in that context that we begin to, I'm going to talk about the shift in context, that we begin to learn things about ourselves that can't be taught with skills and tools, but really we start to understand the context that we grew up in and where those attachment wounds existed that were, again, imperceptible and invisible to us. I want to talk about a couple of myths about therapy. Emma Reedy wrote, she happens to be my daughter and also our senior facilitator at our intensives program. She wrote a blog just this last week based on this idea. This idea that is in our culture sometimes, that some kind of high bar to try to achieve is that we don't need external validation, that we ought not to need external validation. And we're taught that, I think, because in situations growing up where we became difficult for our caregivers to cope with, to deal with, to contain, to see. We were told that we ought not to need external validation. In other words, they transferred their senses of inadequacy onto us. It could have happened with teachers or even peers or partners later on. When people find themselves overwhelmed, when they find their bandwidth, if you will, their emotional bandwidth exceeded, then they, instead of owning it, talk about transferring the problem onto you, transferring the problem as you're too much or not enough. So we're told that we shouldn't need to feel good about ourselves. We shouldn't need to experience ourselves from other people in that way. And we should just somehow, we should draw it up inside of ourselves. But the fact of the matter is that external validation is necessary. The key is to find a source who values the authentic self rather than some part object. That's the most important thing. When I'm talking to a training therapist with this attachment-informed and attachment-based lens, I say, be very careful to emphasize your praise on what you think as a client's accomplishment, what you think it might be. Because the other side of that same coin is that you could then become very disappointed in them when they struggle, instead of empathic and understanding. There is a judgment that can be extrapolated from praising somebody's progress and success, right? I must be good. And children or clients can easily interpret, can conflate affection and love with a sense of adequacy, a sense of self. Alice Miller says, in her opinion, in the drama The Gifted Child, she says, it's impossible for somebody to get out of the cycle of grandiosity and deflation without therapy. And therapy is the only way, she suggests, to cut this tragic link between love and grandiosity. So part of the shift that happens in attachment-informed therapy is you start to re-experience yourself as okay, no matter how you show up. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. We are obviously an experientially based program. Both our wilderness programs and our intensive programs, which are largely based in psychodrama and art therapy. So we believe in how that modality, those modalities can reach parts of ourselves that talk therapy can't reach at times. But this is what sometimes gets missed when people talk about psychotherapy, talk therapy. The greatest risk, the experience of therapy, is showing up in therapy as a client and taking the risk to be who you are. And what you're risking is that the therapist is going to respond the same way that people in your past have responded. I was just talking to my daughter not too long ago. She's the one that's our senior facilitator, and she was training some staff in co-facilitation, and I was encouraging her to give them feedback in some areas that she was observing. And she did, and she came back to me and she said, feedback is hard. It's scary. And I said to her, I said, it's scary in part because it didn't go so well for you in the past, in your earlier contexts. And I was talking about, in large part, me. Because of my own insecurities as a father growing up, I took some of the feedback, both the clear and overt feedback and the subtle, more implicit feedback, and I made it about the child. I've done that as a therapist. I've blamed the client, even taken pride at times in their upset feelings with me, as if that was somehow some kind of badge of honor. I think that obviously that because I'm telling you the truth, because I'm confronting the defense as if that takes any talent whatsoever, any capacity whatsoever, that your dislike of me or your disconnection from me is because of your limitations. That's what I've done as a father and a therapist in the past. What I teach the therapists here at Evoke is that when you get frustrated, upset, anxious with a client, you have lost contact with them. Same with a parent. And again, there's no sin in that. There's no indictment in that. It's just an awareness. It's a description. Sometimes when I talk about the role of the parent in a child's development, people will say there seems to be a lot of blame, a lot of parent blame, mother blame more specifically, because the literature and the research has pointed more towards mothers as primary caregivers. And as I've thought about that, what I realize is that it's just a description. It's not a blame. But because we were taught in our childhoods that when we make mistakes or we're human, that it was somehow to be associated with being bad or feeling bad, or we should feel bad. We associate those mistakes with guilt. We bring that on ourselves. If we can peel back, if we can separate the feeling bad, the guilt, the shame from being human, we can grow. The subtitle of the new book I wrote is called Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self. It's that idea that when we re-experience ourselves in the presence of a non-judgmental, empathic, capable other, what was once horrible is now just what it is. Not something to be ashamed of or shrink away from. It's just that there are parts of us that are not fully developed. They're still bruised, still dented. So the experience of therapy, even if you're talking about the driest psychotherapist with no creativity, is the experience of taking the risk and walking in. And unfortunately, many therapists will re-wound you. I've done it many times. I've re-wounded my clients, and I'll talk about that re-wounding. It's a hard word to say, re-wounding. It takes time. In some ways, I almost wrote this, it takes a lifetime. Right? It becomes our life's work to make sense of ourselves, to unpack early childhood development. The impact of growing up with a bunch of human beings around us, some of whom loved us dearly and dramatically. So I get the question often, can therapy really make a difference where attachment wounds are present and even significant? And that's what I'm going to talk about as we go. To heal, therapy clients must, like I said, re-experience themselves. That's a very important phrase. Therapy clients must re-experience themselves in the presence of an empathic other. This will create the self-compassion in the client required to expand self-awareness. Because somebody said to me just today, I was doing a podcast with Judith Sedora, one of our therapists, and she said, we don't go inward to get rid of ourselves, to get rid of parts of ourselves. We go inward to find ourselves, to heal, to meet ourselves with compassion. So this experience of somebody else seeing us in the way that we're describing through this secure attachment, this reparative experience, that competes with the old experience, creates a kind of self-empathy, a self-compassion. We carry around with us then in the world this copy. Many clients, some that I haven't even talked to, but just through these podcasts, will say to me, I hear your voice in my head. And I tell them, it's just the same voice that I hear in my head from my therapist. In a given moment or a challenge with one of my children or a therapist or a staff that I'm training or a client, I carry around parts of Jamie Gill in me. That's what attachment does, is we carry around this secure person that was modeled. Because when our attachment figure is capable of metabolizing our feelings of distress, and then they can mirror back the sense that we're okay, we start to believe that we're okay. Going on with this quote, this will create the self-compassion in the client required to expand self-awareness. The end result is what Freud suggested was the goal of therapy: freedom. Freedom from unconscious obligations. The experience, the re-experiencing ourselves as okay, frees us up from the unconscious pull that we feel that we have to take care of the people around us to be okay, that we have to show up a certain way, feel a certain way, be a certain way to be okay. I was describing this after attending my very first therapeutic intensives about going to therapy, talking about my therapist, hearing her observations about what I was currently experiencing and how she tied them to common themes. I would find the answers to my question. Through this process, I found myself again each week. It is very difficult to find yourself until you are found by someone else first, she explained to me. Jessica Benjamin, the attachment theorist, taught, the root of the self is almost always found through another person. When someone else finds us, we come to find ourselves. Realizing that I, the client, had the answer to my initial question inside me helped me understand why and how I'd been blocked from finding a solution. So the process of being found is that I find myself. I shared recently that I shared with my therapist sometime last year. Every now and again, after seeing her for over 20 years, I'll reflect on our experience together and just my gratitude for her. And I said to her, after sharing an example with her where somebody confronted me with something that I had done to hurt them, and my initial response mentally was, I wanted to create a story where it wasn't true, where I didn't do what they were saying, what they were accusing me of doing, because that's how I've learned to survive, is that I can't be bad. I can't be wrong. So for the first few seconds of the confrontation, that's the place I went to. And then after sitting for a moment, I thought, that's a ridiculous response, right? That's silly. I did what I did, not from a place of malice, but from a place of brokenness and weakness and just ignorance in some ways. Some ways it can just be an innocent mistake. But even being confronted with innocent mistakes was too much for me. So then I responded to the person with empathy and an apology and an invitation to listen to how I hurt them more. I was describing this story to Jamie in therapy one day last year. And I said to her, you know what it was, Jamie? I said, especially in the darkest times of my life, in the past 21 years, you sat beside me each week without anxiously offering solutions, without a kind of eagerness to fix me. Just the same experience over and over again of trying to find me and understand me. And because you sat with me during those dark times, when now looking back, the solution was simple. It was right in front of me. I could see my blindness looking back several years now. But because you sat with me, I can sit with myself, and that experience I had with the friend that I hurt was the result of that. Because she found me, I could be who I was. Jamie said this in one of her books. The experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was very bad at home is now nothing. The difference in experience allows for the realization things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. This has happened to me on several occasions when I'm treating and supervising our staff and our therapists, where I'm describing this process in supervision, specifically paying attention to countertransference or the therapist's reaction to the client. I think we think of transference and countertransference as much more simple than this. Maybe you had a bully in school that had red hair and your therapist has red hair, so you project onto them that same experience. But it's much more primal than that. It's much more emotional and based than that. At any rate, as I'm doing this kind of supervision where we focus on transference and countertransference and the heart of attachment-informed therapy, on several occasions, the therapists have said to me, "But Brad, we are under the burden, and we are paid a salary, and the program is paid good money to facilitate change in clients. So to be this accepting, this compassionate, to not look at somebody's problems or issues or broken parts with some form of criticism, we're not doing our jobs. We're hired," they say to me, "to help people change and grow." And my response to them is, "I know we are. And this is how you do it. Everything else is just a whitewash. Everything else is just simple first order behavioral change. The deepest work will occur when a person re-experiences themselves in ways that they never have before. And even what you're calling eagerness to get your client to change or improve, still for them sends the unconscious message that they're not okay. I love, and I'm going to quote him a little bit later, David Grant's book on brain spotting, where he says any theoretical approach that does not take into consideration the client's impulse to please the therapist is inadequate. Any theory or approach that does not consider the client's impulse to please or impress the therapist is inadequate. And it goes back to their earliest experiences. People ask me all the time, why are children this way? Why are children inclined to take care of the authority figure, the caregiver? And as we get older and go into therapy, the therapist. And it's a simple answer. Because if our caregiver gets too overwhelmed, too frustrated, too upset, too angry, too anxious, they can abandon us. And we would die because we're rather pathetic creatures as human beings. So it's wired into us, this impulse to make sure that there is a smile or a look of peace and serenity on our caregiver's face. And the experience of a caregiver getting upset, anxious, frustrated, impatient is internalized by the child as something's wrong with them. Isn't that amazing? Because they have no sense of other. Something is wrong with them. And they need to change. It gets more complex and sophisticated as they grow, but that's the early experience. And for many people, it doesn't evolve much past that in many ways. In light of these considerations, Gill says, it seems the most important project one has is to discover who one is and be that person. I've told this story, I think it was 2017. I talk about it in The Audacity to Be You. My adult children were feeling conflicted around the holidays. They wanted their mother, my ex-wife, to come and be with our family, with my wife and children. And she was alone during the holidays, and I could see the pain in my adult children's faces when they were describing their dilemma. And there was a pull in me to be a good dad, to do what I thought was the right thing, the should thing. So I brought this dilemma to Jamie Gill, and I knew I was in trouble when I couldn't ask the question without the word should. But I asked it something like this. I said, Jamie, isn't it the highest ideal, the highest self of a parent to want to be there for the child, even if it causes me some discomfort? Right? It won't ruin my holidays, but it will take it down a notch. We get along okay, but I'll be inhibited if she comes over. But shouldn't I thought to ask, do that for my children, even though they're young adults? And Jamie said simply and calmly, she said, I think the goal is to be you. And then I was free. I thought, that's it. So hard, so simple to say, so hard to remember. And so 2017, I wasn't inclined to have her over. It wasn't where I was. Actually, ironically, I don't tell this in the book, but she came over in 2018 for Thanksgiving. And by the end of Thanksgiving evening, we had such a wonderful time. We invited her back for Christmas. And now 2019, she came for Thanksgiving and Christmas again. And it's kind of our tradition now. But where I was at that time in 2017, it was just how I was feeling. And I needed the freedom to be that person, to be who I was. Part of the business of psychotherapy, Gill says, is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different space is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is noticed and discussed. The world is allowed to be one of noticeable constructions. We learn by this unique, when you go to Italy, if you allow yourself to be in Italy, or you go to Switzerland, or you go to China, or you go to Bali, for those of you who have traveled, one of the things that you will notice when you're there is that it's not America. It's not where you live. It's different. When you learn a new language, you learn things about your mother tongue that you never thought of, never considered. Changing context. Jamie actually talks about this in one of her books, specifically in regard to our wilderness therapy program. She says the context is so dramatically different in wilderness therapy that it illuminates one's own. One of the things that I'm so proud of at our intensives program, because they are so supported with this idea of attachment-informed therapy, is that clients will say, I found it different than every place I've been before. Not just the exercises, which are powerful and emotionally evocative, but I was allowed to be me. There's a phrase that some people in therapy use called trust the process. I talk about this all the time. And I'm not fond of that, because what if you come with distrust? What if you come with skepticism? What if you have a context where it wasn't wise or safe of you to trust authority figures? Are you supposed to deny that? And I've thought about shifting our motto to come as you are, and we'll take you where you're at. That's the difference in the most simplistic term between attachment-informed therapy and other forms of psychotherapy, is you get to be you. And I don't get to demand in this model of attachment-informed therapy that you just drop your defenses, because in my opinion, they don't serve you well. Instead, I try to understand your defenses, have compassion, see the meaning behind them. And in that exchange, in that process, you can heal. I love this quote from Gill. These are from various books that she's written, Jamie Gill. I think she's up to 17 or 18. Jamie says, the therapist or guide we choose must not duplicate the wounds of the past. Thus, if the therapist or guide knows what is right for us and manipulates us to achieve these treatment goals, it is abuse, plain and simple. And then this is my favorite line. it is hard to see how good abuse ever cures bad abuse. It's important. She says this in the foreword of the book, my new book. She says, if your therapist knows your truth, find a new therapist. In autocratic or strict father families, parents are more interested in you thinking and believing and feeling the right thing, not what you do feel. And so the therapist who thinks they know what your truth is just duplicating the wounds of the past. And they may justify it in the context of, I want what's best for you, but that's the same thing our parents did. So an attachment-informed therapist, an analytically informed therapist, a therapist who understands child development becomes much more interested in what you are feeling instead of what you should be feeling. Like I said, this is David Grant. He wrote, this is from his book, Brain Spotting. I love brain spotting because it's so informed and influenced by attachment-informed therapy and attunement. He says, in psychotherapy speak, there must be a high level of relational attunement, meaning therapists must pay close attention not only to the clients, but also to the dynamics of the relationship between themselves and the client, which mirrors and reveals the client's experience with the primary caretakers of their childhood, especially their mother. It's not about tools or skills, although those are present. It's not about problem solving or solutions, although those can be present in psychotherapy and attachment-informed psychotherapy. It's definitely not about advice, but it's about the exploration of what happened to you and how that formed you. And it's about this new kind of experience of somebody seeking to find you, even when your symptoms are so self-sabotaging. And what becomes insidious about the process of many versions of psychotherapy is that the therapist who attempts to tear away from you your defenses, those things that have protected you from harming experiences in early childhood, they call it love. One of my critiques about some of the self-help that's out there these days is that they look to shame us for our defenses, our lack of courage, for example. I was dealing with a young man some time ago after working with his parents for a while. And at one point, he received all kinds of diagnoses from treatment programs. And in discussions, I simply saw this scared little boy that was trying to figure out how to feel safe and how to be right and good. At one point, it was suggested possibly that he was a sociopath, which was incredibly frustrating for me to know. And as I was describing to him some of what he described as his twisted thinking that he's been addressing in psychotherapy, I said to him, I'm not sure that it's that twisted. I think maybe in your upbringing, there was trauma related to your parents' anxiety and anxiety disorders. And he said, wait a second. Are you saying my parents were anxious? I said, not just anxious, but they have full-blown anxiety disorders. And so part of your experience of not feeling safe and having things pulled out of you because it soothed them is why you have what you call twisted thinking. And again, you could see the relief in the young man. And he said to me, nobody's ever said anything about my parents' anxiety in 18 months of therapy. And when I recounted the story to the parents, explaining the discussion I'd had, I said it's very important that you talk to your children about your anxious issues. Because one thing that children cannot thrive in is where they think everything is about them. Parents' frustration and anxiety is all about them. They can thrive in environments where they have human parents. If successful child development is dependent upon parents being perfect, all children are doomed. And so the way we kind of meet in the middle is we just own it. We get comfortable at apologizing, at owning our mistakes. And we don't let that apology necessarily compromise our boundaries at all. We don't have to compromise our boundaries because we recognize that we make human mistakes every day. We can still be ourselves. This is kind of a synthesis from what Gil talks about. Therapy is a place we go to receive a different response than the one we received from our earlier contexts, to be received completely and entirely. An adequate therapist responds to our warts, our wounds, and our symptoms with calmness, understanding, patience, and curiosity. The therapist is not anxious to fix us, but rather is passionate about finding us. And when we are found and seen without the anxiety, frustration, or disappointment we experienced in our earlier context, we come to believe that we are okay. Can you sense from this that it takes time? We are able to look deeply into ourselves at this point, into our wounds and our traumas with compassion and understanding, and we heal. I want to be clear that attachment theory is strongly based in the evidence, the research evidence out there. In fact, brain scans and studies of the brain, they support everything that we're talking about today. That a child's developing brain develops trauma responses when the environment is not well attuned to their needs, responses, feelings. When a parent is anxious, a child's brain develops patterns of responses that are based on a world that is not safe. They experience themselves through their parents' anxiety as living and growing up in an unsafe world. That is why it is incumbent upon us as parents, me as a father, you as parents, to work through our trauma and fear. It's not that that's not deserved because our children do things that are objectively frightening, especially when they have mental health and addiction issues. It's just that we go somewhere to sort that out. We get help for that fear, because living fearfully with anxiety and bringing that to the relationship will cause the child's brain to develop in such a way that they'll have a difficult time finding peace and serenity. And oftentimes, the mental health symptoms, the substances that they ingest, are an attempt to capture that feeling of safety. Alcohol, heroin, and opiates give the individual the sense of calmness that is present in an attachment experience. There's research that shows the relationship between the amount of pain medication that people need post-surgery and growing up with a secure versus a non-secure attachment. The research talked about in Parenting from the Inside Out shows that having a parent who can provide a secure attachment causes resiliency in children. In fact, in my dissertation, and I had no idea what I was thinking about or doing, it's like a miracle that it even happened. When I was getting my doctorate degree, the research I did was looking at childhood trauma and anything that might mitigate it. And of all of the measures that we gave to these young adults that measured whether or not they had satisfying, stable adult relationships, of all of the measures, all of the questions that we asked them, they all had identified childhood trauma. The one thing that they identified that predicted an ability or the experience that they'd be having in young adulthood of healthy and satisfying and stable adult relationships is identifying that one person saw them. One person was consistent in their life that saw them. That was the greatest predictor. They all had trauma. That was the greatest predictor of whether or not they identified themselves as having healthy, stable adult relationships with partners. So it's early. It's attachment, the attachment experience. I'm not going to talk about attachment theory. I have other broadcasts on that, but the secure attachment versus non-secure attachment, I'll just put them into two categories. Has a powerful physiological effect on brain development. And that development effect affects the way that a human being responds. So we try to create competing experiences. And because psychotherapy is typically 1 or a couple of hours a week, of course, at Evoke, it can be more immersive than that. And that's part of why it can be more effective. But we try to create competing experiences with those earlier experiences that start to bring up, like has been described this evening, the kinds of awarenesses that maybe what we have come to believe about ourselves, about the world, is not true. And it starts to build new neural pathways. And it takes time for all of us. And small doses over a short period of time often don't make that much of a difference. But over a long period of time, we can begin to have a competing experience, like I said. Alice Miller said, if a child is lucky enough to grow up with a mirroring, available mother who is at the child's disposal, that is a child's development, then healthy self-feeling can gradually develop in the growing child. Ideally, this mother should also provide the necessary emotional climate and understanding for the child's needs. But here's the key. Even a mother who is not especially warm-hearted can make this development possible if only she refrains from preventing it and allows the child to acquire from other people what she herself lacks. This is why it can be so valuable for my children, Brad Reedy's children, to be with other adults. This is why I drop them off at softball practice, and I leave. This is why boarding school or summer camp can make a difference. It's not an indictment on me as a human being. It's important that they be exposed to other people who don't get as anxious about their potential lack of development as I do, as you do. And then we call that anxiety love, and it's not. It's not love. It's fear. It's the exact opposite, in fact. So we allow our children at times to get it from other places. I've shared this. My son is going, hopefully, if the country opens back up, he's going to college in New York in the fall, which is the same college that I would like to teach at. And we've talked about moving to New York. But we decided as a family when he applied that if he got accepted to that college, that we weren't going to go there for at least a couple of years, if not his entire time, because he needs to get away. He needs to experience other. When my oldest son, who's now 27, went away at the age of 19, it was that same message that I've shared with you. He needs to get as far away from me as he can and experience other. That's part of what Dr. Miller is talking about. I love this as my concluding slide. Carl Rogers, who I think people who imitate Carl Rogers are nothing like Carl Rogers, by the way. He's a famous master therapist. He said, when a person realizes he has been deeply hurt, his eyes moisten. I think in some real sense, he is weeping for joy. It is as though he were saying, thank God somebody heard me. Somebody knows what it's like to be me. I'm going to tell this one last story before I open it up for questions because I think it's so beautiful and poetic. My therapist tells the story of meeting with a client in analysis several times a week for many years. And at times in analysis, there's no form or format necessarily. The client or analysan, they're called, will come in and just start talking, free associating. There's no right way to do it or wrong way to do it. That's another thing about psychotherapy that's attachment informed. You can't, if you're the client, do it wrong. At any rate, the client comes in, and sometimes it was confusing for the analyst because sometimes it wasn't clear whether or not the client was talking about a present day situation or about something that happened in her childhood. And the client grew up in a rural area of Germany near a river. And the analyst said one time she was talking and I knew it was a historical story because I could smell the river near her childhood home. And I love that poetic sense of what attunement ultimately is like. It's when we can smell the river. And the audacity to be you, I say, to understand somebody, you have to lose your mind. sometimes. We have to understand other. And to do that, like Gandhi says, we have to heroically look at our own journey. We have to take responsibility for ourselves. We have to do our own work. So I'm happy to take any questions if any have come up. I have a challenge to understand the difference in owning my anxiety and getting comfortable with bringing it in as an apology with my young adult son and focus on my issues to do my work on me instead of outside with my sponsor or therapist. That's the right work. You're right. It takes time to get clear on what's yours and how to own it. You know, it's learning to discovering your okayness enough that you can show up and just own your stuff, own your limitations. So it takes practice. It takes work with a sponsor or a therapist. Absolutely right. You're on the journey. You're on the path to figure that out. And for most of us, because we conflate apologizing with being wrong, and therefore we need to eradicate our boundaries and become boundaryless, and we can't have accountability in our lives, right? That kind of cascades all the way down. We don't know how to just apologize, how to just be present with our horrible, rotten self. So I really, really commend your comment and your journey. Someone else says, if a child is negatively impacted by an anxious parent, feeling insecure or unsafe, what is the impact on the child of a depressed parent? Is it similar than that of an anxious parent to child, or does it differ? There can be small brushstrokes that are different, but it's essentially the same thing. Depression and anxiety are kind of siblings to each other, right? It's a sense of unwellness and powerlessness. There's distinctions. Depression is hatred turned inward. Anxiety is future worry, fear focus. There's differences in the different presentations, but essentially, there's anxious attachment, there's avoidant attachment, there's chaotic or disorganized attachment, and there's secure attachment. Those are the 4 types. I'm not talking about those tonight, but essentially, I'm just describing secure versus non-secure attachment, a feeling of safety, of security, of being welcomed versus something else. I said last year in social media, I made a comment about how often children are gaslighted by their children, that most parents gaslight children, which is to tell a child that what they feel their experience is wrong, essentially. And I got a lot of blowback from people. Some people citing some research that says the research shows that 2/3 of children grow up in a securely attached home, which I don't know how that's measured. I don't, that's not my experience even close, right? And it's a continuum for that matter. So it's probably not as binary as even I'm suggesting versus secure and unsecure, but it's just a sense of that the world is okay. And when you grow up feeling that the world is okay and that it's safe, then you're okay. And then you just get to be you. And then when somebody tells you what not to feel or what to feel, you respond with, that's not how I grew up. I grew up knowing that how I felt was enough. And I didn't have to be right. I just got to feel what I felt. And so when a child grows up in that context and people tell them they're wrong, they look at that person like, well, that's very strange. I don't think I want to spend a lot of time around you because that's not how I grew up. That's not okay with me. Someone says, what do you do when it all feels so hard? I have felt the benefits of doing my work and invested so much of myself into it. But lately, it has been feeling all too much to keep connecting to the pain and sadness and working through all the emotions I never let myself feel and finding a way to allow myself to feel them now, along with the people close to me, are feeling neglected or want to remind me of how I haven't changed. I have contemplated taking a break from therapy and the rest of my work, but wondering if this is wise or if this is where I need to push through. I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you, and there's been times in my work as a client where I wanted to give up. And I've said this recently to the Evoke therapist. I said, you know, essentially, at the end of a session, a client ought to feel a little bit better, don't you think? Ideally. And they challenged me on this. They said, but Brad, part of our holding space for clients is to get them into their pain and their grief and their sadness. And I said, that's true. That's a good point. Therapy does get people into that pain that's unexplored. But I said, but even in those examples, if you're doing therapy in the way that we describe and that we teach at Evoke, you'll feel a little bit less alone. And so the touching and the visiting your pain won't be what the Buddhists call suffering. Pain is inevitable, they say, but suffering is optional. So what I would say, what I did with my therapist at the times when I contemplated quitting, is I went to her and I told her how I felt. And ultimately, I decided not to quit and not to give up. Although there were a couple of times where I took a break, a month or two here or there. But ultimately, now therapy is my favorite hour of the week. Again, it's the 1 hour Friday mornings at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. It's the 1 hour a week that I don't have to get it right. And I'm not the biggest person in the room. And I don't have to contain things. I can vent, I can complain, I can whine, I can be angry, I can be sad, I can be anxious, I can be hopeless. And my therapist, I have this wonderful therapist, this 80-year-old woman who's been training her whole life for this, and she knows how to just be with me. To see and to validate whatever I bring. Sometimes we talk about therapy cases. Sometimes we talk about movies or music or politics. But she holds it for me. So you do what you want. The times when I told Jamie I wanted to take a break, her response was, okay. That was her response. And it wasn't long. The breaks weren't long and they weren't often. Someone says, how does attachment theory affect adopted children? Adoption is just an obvious attachment fracture. It's really the giving up for adoption and oftentimes the lack of attunement that can be present in adoption. But some of those attachment fractures can be present in non-adopted families. And so in this way of thinking that I'm talking about tonight, adoption is not necessarily qualitatively different than the attachment fractures and wounds that all of us have somewhere along that continuum. There's so much about mental health and mental illness that we want to reduce it to a binary, right? You're either mentally healthy or you're mentally ill. You either have an attachment disorder or you don't. You either have trauma or you don't, although that one's probably a little bit more accepted that it's a continuum. But the fact of the matter is it's not binary. There's mental health and mental illness, and it's a continuum, and we're all on it. And so it's the same discussion, the same kind of experience. There are unique challenges in a child who's been put up for adoption and transracially adopted children and children that are atypical neurologically speaking. If you come from a different genetic background, the chances that you'll be characteristically, visually, even aesthetically looking the way you look, that there'll be differences is higher, right? That makes sense because it's not the same genetic pool, but it's the same work. It's most likely better to understand it in terms of a series of on a continuum instead of a kind of a two-pile situation. And I have seen children with attachment issues living in the family, the genetic family with their birth parents. I've seen significant attachment issues and attachment wounds and attachment trauma. And I've seen families with adopted children who have less severe attachment wounds and fractures. So it's more to the process than it is to that specific event, although that specific event can predict some traumas that tend to be more common. Someone says, if a child has grown up with a parent that has had severe anxiety and the child has been negatively impacted, is it possible to help them even if they are now an adult, 18, and so how? I'm glad that you asked that. I remember, I want to tell you this story. When I was in undergraduate school, we had this simple model of they divided family styles into 4 different styles. It was a long time ago. I think one was closed, one was open, one was chaotic, and one was structured, I think is what it was. Structured was kind of the ideal. And there were all kinds of ways to understand. I think the closed people, everybody comes through the front door formally. The open system, people are crawling in and out of the windows, or they're coming in the back door. And the chaotic one, people are climbing in and out of the windows. And the structured one is it showed some flexibility. Anyway, the professor, I remember saying to us, saying, this is kind of a way of understanding families and generally how they operate. It's one model. And then the professor said, but if there's severe anxiety in the family, all of this goes out the window. That overshadows all of this. And as a 20-something-year-old person, I thought, excuse me, first of all, what's the big deal of anxiety? And that's probably pretty rare anyway, right? And why would that have such a powerful overriding impact on children? And now, of course, as a father and a therapist and somebody who's done some of their own work, I realize how it really is fear. Right? That's what our myths tell us. That's what our stories tell us. That there are two sources of kind of energy in the universe. There's love and there's fear, simply put. And when we're driven by, affected by, swimming in, grow up in fear, more than less, it makes us feel unsafe and unsure. And that's a scary place for a child to live. And so the responses are going to be hypersensitive to perceived threats or real threats. And when we go up in a place of safety and love, there's going to be more flexibility, less of a knee-jerk reaction, less of a flight or fight response, less of a reactive response, a more patient, calming response. So, yes, it doesn't matter if he's 18. In fact, most of the work that I've done is over the age of 30. And some of the work that I've done with my mother has been in the last 10 years, and I'm 52 years old. So it's never too late. Never too late. And in fact, when I have a client that's in their 70s, for example, when I see clients in their 70s, when they come to the intensives in their 60s and 70s and they're still growing and still learning and still exploring, I think to myself, it's so beautiful to see this because most people die long before they're dead. Most people stop growing. Most people stop asking questions. And when I find somebody, when I encounter somebody who's still willing to look and to grow, it's amazing. You can make a difference. 18 is not even close to being too late. My mother said to me a handful of years ago, "I'm so sorry, Brad, you were too big. I was smaller than you. I was overwhelmed as a single mother. And I'm sorry, and I know it impacted you." She said that as recently as Mother's Day. And I wasn't waiting for that, but it was healing. It was confirming of everything I've been teaching and working on in therapy for 2.5 decades. So it's not even close to too late. Someone says, "I've done a lot of work since my oldest son was of more crucial development age. So it's really obvious that my attachment is different with my younger sons." No kidding, me too. Anxiety better handled, etc. I think it contributes to him feeling jealous about the difference. Do I just bring this up to my oldest son, or it was not too long ago that we were on a Zoom conference call with all of the children and my wife's child, which they all kind of act like they're all siblings. So there's 5 total, 2 with my first wife and 2 with my second wife and my ex-wife, and it was a birthday party and my wife's child that she had with her husband. So we were all talking, and at one point I was teasing the now 21-year-old about being old enough to drink now, and I teased him about, "I'm sure you've never had a drink before." And somebody commented that I'd made a really uncomfortable statement. And my son, who's 27 years old, he said, "You guys can be grateful because I paved the way for you, because I got sent away to therapy for having a drink when I was a teenager. I got sent away to a wilderness program for 16 weeks. And we all kind of laughed at it. And I said, "Absolutely. Like my development, my son, who's 27, got a much more anxious parent than my 12-year-old. My bandwidth has expanded in the past 16, 17, 18 years. Absolutely." And so I think it's always a nice, wonderful moment when a parent can like my mother did a handful of years ago, say, you know, I realized it was probably hard to be my son, my daughter. And here are some ways I'm becoming aware of it. And apologizing. And you know what they'll most do? They'll say, oh, you're overreacting. You're being too sensitive. But they'll hear it. Even if they're not doing their work, they'll hear it. And again, you won't be coming from this deflated, guilt-ridden, shame-ridden place. You'll be coming from the place of confidence and authenticity. And they won't know that, but that's okay. It can be valuable seeds to plant. So absolutely. I'm going to just go with all the upcoming events, and then we'll wrap up if there's any leftover questions. We have intensives online now. So this is all of our intensives. Finding You in person in June and July. We are setting up to have those. Finding You 2, there's a new one we just opened up July 15th through 19th. We're doing a Finding You 2 online. So if you've been to a Finding You online, you can come to a Finding You 2 online, August 6th through 8th. Our online Finding You intensive, Finding You 1 is June 5th through 7th, July 6th through 8th. So go to our webpage or email intensives@evoketherapy.com to find out about all our intensive offerings, which really are a great companion to this broadcast because it's a deep dive into this work. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous. Feel free to try ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics. AdultChildren.org is the place to go to. Alateen is for teenagers. Refuge Recovery is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of an emphasis on a higher power. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI.org, is a great place to go to get resources or free classes in your area. Everybody in all of these groups is offering online offerings right now. You can follow us on social media. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app the next day. Search on any of your favorite podcast app on any device. Search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram by using the handle @Evoke Therapy. You can find our Evoke Intensives program on Instagram using Evoke Therapy Intensives as the handle. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or the Evoke Family Foundation, which is about to go close unless we get some more board members. So if you want to volunteer to be on the board, please reach out to Malia@evoketherapy.com. The Evoke Family Foundation raises money for people who can't afford therapy. And of course, our Evoke Therapy blog is a place for new content each week. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. So you can go there. And then we're going to have our next broadcast next Monday, June 1st. It's June already coming up. Monday, June 1st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, and I'll announce the topic coming up. So thank you for showing up for and on behalf of your children or your loved ones who are struggling. I absolutely want to honor and thank you for being willing to do your work. It is the greatest gift and the greatest contribution you can make to their well-being, to their development. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the heroic challenge of taking the responsibility for your own journey. Have a great night, folks, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.